Canadians are the people who are identified with the Canadian nation. This connection may be residential, legal, historical, or cultural. For most Canadians, several of these connections exist and are collectively the source of their being Canadian. The majority of the population is made up of Old World immigrants and their descendants. Following the initial period of French and then the much larger British colonization, different waves of immigration and settlement of non-Aboriginal peoples took place over the course of nearly 2 centuries and continue today. Elements of Aboriginal, French, British and more recent immigrant customs, languages and religions have combined to form the culture of Canada and thus a Canadian identity. Canada has also been strongly influenced by its linguistic, geographic and economic neighbour, the United States. Canadian independence from Great Britain grew gradually over the course of many years since the formation of the Canadian Confederation in 1867. World War I and World War II in particular gave rise to a desire amongst Canadians to have their country recognized as a fully fledged sovereign state with a distinct citizenship. Legislative independence was established with the passage of the Statute of Westminster 1931. The Canadian Citizenship Act of 1946 took effect on January 1, 1947, and full sovereignty was achieved with the patriation of the Constitution in 1982. Canada's nationality law closely mirrored that of the United Kingdom. Legislation since the mid-20th century represents Canadians' commitment to multilateralism and socio-economic development. Population. As of 2010, Canadians make up 0.5% of the world's total population, having relied upon immigration for population growth and social development. Approximately 41% of current Canadians are first or second-generation immigrants, and 20% of Canadian residents in the 2000s were not born in the country. Statistics Canada projects that, by 2031, nearly one-half of Canadians above the age of 15 will be foreign-born or have one foreign-born parent. Aboriginal peoples, according to the 2011 Canadian census, numbered at 1,400,685 or 4.3% of the country's 33,476,688 population. Immigration. The French originally settled New France, in present-day Quebec and Ontario, and Acadia, in present-day Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, during the early part of the 17th century. Approximately 100 Irish-born families would settle the St. Lawrence Valley by 1700, assimilating into the Canadians' population and culture. During the 18th and 19th century, immigration westward was carried out by voyagers, French settlers working for the Northwest Company, and by British settlers representing the Hudson's Bay Company, coupled with independent entrepreneurial woodsmen called coureurs des bois. This arrival of newcomers led to the creation of the Amiaqutis, an ethnic group of mixed European and First Nations parentage. The British conquest of New France was preceded by a small number of Germans and Swedes who settled alongside the Scottish in Port Royal, Nova Scotia, while some Irish immigrated to the colony of Newfoundland. In the wake of the 1775 invasion of Canada by the newly formed Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War, approximately 60,000 United Empire Loyalists fled to British North America, a large portion of whom migrated to New Brunswick. After the War of 1812, British, Scottish and Irish immigration was encouraged throughout Rupert's Land, Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Between 1815 and 1850, some 800,000 immigrants came to the colonies of British North America, mainly from the British Isles as part of the Great Migration of Canada. These new arrivals included some Gaelic-speaking Highland Scots displaced by the Highland clearances to Nova Scotia. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s significantly increased the pace of Irish immigration to Prince Edward Island and the province of Canada, with over 35,000 distressed individuals landing in Toronto in 1847 and 1848. Beginning in the late 1850s, the immigration of Chinese into the colony of Vancouver Island and colony of British Columbia peaked with the onset of the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush. The Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 eventually placed a head tax on all Chinese immigrants, in hopes of discouraging Chinese immigration. After completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the population of Canada has consistently risen, doubling approximately every 40 years. Since the establishment of the Canadian Confederation in 1867, from the mid to late 19th century, Canada had a policy of assisting immigrants from Europe, including an estimated 100,000 unwanted home children from Britain. Block settlement communities were established throughout Western Canada between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some were planned and others were spontaneously created by the settlers themselves. Canada was now receiving a large number of European immigrants, predominantly Italians, Germans, Scandinavians, Dutch, Poles, and Ukrainians. Legislative restrictions on immigration that had favored British and other European immigrants were amended in the 1960s, opening the doors to immigrants from all parts of the world. While the 1950s had still seen high levels of immigration by Europeans, by the 1970s, immigrants were increasingly Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, Jamaican and Haitian. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Canada received many American Vietnam War draft dissenters. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, Canada's growing Pacific trade brought with it a large influx of South Asians, who tended to settle in British Columbia. Immigrants of all backgrounds tend to settle in the major urban centres. The Canadian public as well as the major political parties support immigration. The majority of illegal immigrants come from the southern provinces of the People's Republic of China, with Asia as a whole, Eastern Europe, Caribbean, Africa and the Middle East all contributing to the illegal population. Estimates of numbers of illegal immigrants range between 35,000 and 120,000. A 2008 report by the Auditor General of Canada Sheila Fraser stated that Canada has lost track of approximately 41,000 illegal immigrants whose visas have expired. Citizenship and diaspora. Canadian citizenship is typically obtained by birth in Canada or by birth or adoption abroad when at least one biological parent or adoptive parent is a Canadian citizen who was born in Canada or naturalized in Canada. It can also be granted to a permanent resident who lives in Canada for 3 out of 4 years and meets specific requirements. Canada established its own nationality law in 1946 with the enactment of the Canadian Citizenship Act, which took effect on January 1, 1947. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act was passed by the Parliament of Canada in 2001 as Bill C-11, which replaced the Immigration Act of 1976 as the primary federal legislation regulating immigration. Prior to the conferring of legal status on Canadian citizenship, Canada's naturalization laws consisted of a multitude of acts beginning with the Immigration Act of 1910. According to Citizenship and Immigration Canada, there are 3 main classifications for immigrants: family class, economic class and refugee class. In 2008, there were 65,567 immigrants in the family class, 21,860 refugees, and 149,072 economic immigrants amongst the 247,243 total immigrants to the country. Canada resettles over 1 in 10 of the world's refugees and has one of the highest per capita immigration rates in the world. As of a 2010 report by the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, there were 2.8 million Canadian citizens abroad. This represents about 8% of the total Canadian population. Of those living abroad, the United States, Hong Kong, the United Kingdom, Taiwan, China, Lebanon, United Arab Emirates and Australia have the largest Canadian diaspora. Canadians in the United States constitute the greatest single expatriate community at over 1 million in 2009, representing 35.8% of all Canadians abroad. Under current Canadian law, Canada does not restrict dual citizenship, but Passport Canada encourages its citizens to travel abroad on their Canadian passport, so they can access Canadian consular services. Ethnic Ancestry Canada has 34 ethnic groups with at least 100,000 members each, of which 11 have over 1 million people, and numerous others are represented in smaller amounts. According to the 2006 census, the largest self-reported ethnic origin is Canadian, followed by English, French, Scottish, Irish, German, Italian, Chinese, North American Indian, Ukrainian, and Dutch. In the 2006 census, over 5 million Canadians identified themselves as a member of a visible minority. Together, they make up 16.2% of the total population. Most numerous among these are South Asian, Black, and Filipino. Aboriginal peoples are not considered a visible minority under the Employment Equity Act, and this is the definition that Statistics Canada also uses. For a complete list, see